Good morning, everyone. Let's get started. Thank you all for being here. My name is Beth Harrison. I'm a supervising attorney at Legal Aid in DC in our housing unit, and I've been doing eviction cases for 10 years now. And so I'm going to lead us off in the training. And I wanted to start just very quickly. So if you look at the materials in front of you, there's an agenda, but then there's something that says test your housing knowledge. And I actually feel like in the district nowadays, the affordable housing crisis is so grave that in a way I don't need to do this. Because if you have, now some of you may not live in the district, but if you have tried to rent or own in the district, you probably have some sense of what the housing market's like. Um, but this is just, I'm going to run through it quickly to give you an idea of the situation that my clients face. So most of my clients live below the federal poverty level. We serve up to 200%, so the cases you would get through this project may be people at twice that level, but most of my clients are actually below even the federal poverty level. For a single person, that's under $12,000. So that's about $1,000 a month, and you can imagine to try to pay rent in the District of Columbia and everything else, how challenging that is. So I'm just going to run through this quickly. So housing, the standard for affordability that the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development uses is that you should pay about 30% of your income towards rent. Some of you may say, I think I pay more than 30%. But that's where housing is considered to be affordable and sustainable. If your housing cost is at that level, you'll be able to pay the rest of your bills. The percentage of DC residents, and I'll tell you, to answer these questions, it's real easy because you just have to get in a negative frame of mind and then you'll answer every single one correctly. So the percentage of DC residents who spend half or more of their income on housing is 1 in 4. The fair market rent for a 2-bedroom apartment in DC, so this is looking kind of across the city, and HUD determines what they think based on all the markets, the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom in DC is. Obviously, you cannot get this in a lot of neighborhoods, is $14.58, but the average market rent for a 1-bedroom, so an even smaller unit, is $2,000 at this point, and that's just a number that keeps growing. It's probably, I checked that a couple months ago, so it's probably higher than that at this point. If you are working in DC at the minimum wage, which right now is $9.50, which is higher than it is in some places in the US, the rent that you could afford, the monthly rent, would be $4.94 on that minimum wage job. To afford a 2-bedroom apartment, if you were making minimum wage, you'd have to work 118 hours a week. And that's more than twice 40, right? So that means even if you have 2 adults in your household working minimum wage jobs full time, you cannot afford that fair market rent. A lot of my clients are individuals with disabilities who the Social Security Administration has determined cannot work, and they do not work. So they get either Social Security disability or a program called SSI, Supplemental Security Income, which is for folks who have disabilities but don't even have enough work history to kind of get the minimum disability benefits. And so those benefits are usually $733 a month right now. And so on that kind of benefit, you can afford a rent of $220. I can tell you those apartments do not exist in DC. I'm sure you're not shocked to hear that. But even DC has rent control. Without a subsidy, you cannot find an apartment for $220 a month, period. You can go to far southeast and go to a rent control building where rents haven't gone up for years, and you're not going to find that rent. And so individuals who get that kind of income are either homeless or they have a subsidy. And that's what this project is all about, is those folks who have subsidies and trying to make sure they hold on to that subsidy, because that's the only way they're going to be able to afford it. The next question, I apologize that I keep meaning to correct this and I keep forgetting, so this is actually slightly incorrect. But the number of individuals who are served by the DC Housing Authority's subsidized housing programs, it's actually a combination of A and B. So it's roughly 20,000 families. And then the number of families on the wait list is 40,000. I think that number actually really understates the need. A couple years ago, and this is question 11, there's a centralized waiting list that DC Housing Authority maintains for all subsidized housing programs in DC. It has been closed for about 3 years now. So that means if you're homeless, whatever your circumstances, you cannot get on that waiting list. The waiting list at this point is 40,000 families. When they closed it, it was actually almost 70,000 families. And what happens is they do what they call a scrub. They send out a notice to whatever address they have on file, and if you don't respond, your name is off that list. In my opinion, the roughly 30,000 people who were scrubbed, many of them probably still live in the district, just didn't get the notice, didn't respond, still are in need of that housing. And so, the need for subsidized housing is much larger than obviously what is being met. On that waiting list, the DC Housing Authority prioritizes individuals who are homeless. If you are homeless, so if you are not homeless and you're on that waiting list, you are never getting a subsidy, period, essentially. Some families, if they have an individual with a disability who needs an accessible unit, there are a couple exceptions, but in general, if you're not homeless, you're never getting off that waiting list. If you are homeless, the wait to get off of that waiting list, how long you have to be homeless before that preference makes a difference, is 10 years. And it can be even longer. And so you are homeless in shelter, doubled up, whatever it is you're doing for 10 years before you even have a chance of being off that waiting list. And of course, that's only if you were lucky enough to be on it before it was closed. And then part of what is going on in DC, we have subsidies in place to help, but it's just that the number of affordable units is shrinking because of rent control not being as effective, just because of the market moving. And so in the last 10 plus years, the number of affordable units has shrunk in DC by half. And so those are just some statistics to try to give you a flavor of the situation that my client community and the client community that you all will be serving under this project are dealing with. And I just want to say a minute, we're going to get into the training, but just want to say something for a minute about this project and kind of why we're doing this, and specifically why we chose to focus on tenants and subsidized housing. So a group of housing advocates across the city came together a couple years ago to have a conversation about, and actually we're at Arnold & Porter. I know many of you in the office are, in the audience, are from Arnold & Porter. Jim Sandman, former managing partner of his office, was one of the folks who helped us come together and said, look, I want to do something with pro bono attorneys to address housing because this is such a crisis. So as a community, we started talking about what to do. We focused on eviction defense, but specifically started talking about families and subsidized housing. And we'll talk more about subsidized housing on the second day of the training next week. But subsidized housing, what that means is that family pays the income, pays rent based on their income at that 30% of income level. So the housing is affordable to them. The government makes up the difference. That subsidy, based on everything I just said, is critical. For most of these families, if they lose that subsidy, they cannot afford their rent. Many of them are the individuals with disability income who could afford a couple $100s at most. So those families, if they lose that, are very likely to just spiral into long-term homelessness. The way this ties into eviction is that many subsidies you automatically lose if you're evicted, because that subsidy is tied to that physical rental unit. So you're not just evicted from your home, you lose that subsidy. You don't have a subsidy anymore. And for other families, they may have a portable subsidy that they can carry around, but eviction is a ground to toss a family out of the program. And we have seen the DC Housing Authority be much more aggressive in the last, I would say, 5 years about kicking families out of the program once they have been evicted. We fight those cases when we find out about them. But the point for you to take home is each of these cases is a family in need who has a subsidy, and if they actually lose that eviction case, may lose that subsidy and really face homelessness the next day. That's why we think these cases are so important. And that's why we decided that we wanted to, as a community, come around this kind of idea of a right to counsel, and specifically in those cases. Questions about any of what I've said so far? So I'm going to go into, and I hope people don't find it distracting for me to stand, but I feel like if I sat down, I wouldn't be able to see. So we're just going to launch